All right. So, listeners have sent in this case, and it's really fascinating, but also really tough.
Yeah.
The story of Anneliese Michel. And
Yeah.
we're really diving into some heavy stuff here.
Yeah.
We've got medical history and intense religious beliefs and a very controversial exorcism.
Yeah, and I think what's so striking is how this all happened in 1970s Germany,
Yeah.
You'd think of that time as, secularization, scientific progress.
Right.
But in Bavaria specifically, where Anneliese lived,
Right.
traditional Catholic beliefs were still very much part of the culture, especially about demonic forces.
Yeah, it's really interesting how that sets the stage for this kind of collision of worldviews.
Absolutely.
Right, because Anneliese was deeply religious from a young age. So when she starts experiencing seizures at 16, initially they're diagnosed as temporal lobe epilepsy, but there's already this kind of underlying tension between those medical explanations and potential spiritual ones.
For sure. And that tension only grows as her condition gets worse. And it's important to understand that, temporal lobe epilepsy, well, it can actually cause hallucinations and altered states of consciousness.
Wow.
So imagine you're experiencing these really vivid, often terrifying, sensory distortions that you just can't control.
That must have been so frightening for her, especially given her strong faith.
Absolutely.
The sources also mention that she was diagnosed with depression and potentially even psychosis.
Right.
So that just adds further layers of complexity to what she was going through.
Absolutely. Psychosis, that can involve a whole range of symptoms, hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking.
Right.
It can make it really difficult to sort of distinguish what's real and what's not.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, this is also a time when mental illness carried a lot of stigma.
Of course.
So it wasn't something that was openly talked about or easily understood.
So it's on the one hand, you have this young woman who is dealing with these very real and serious neurological and psychological conditions. But then on the other hand, you have this community that's so steeped in these traditional beliefs about demonic influence.
Right.
It's almost like you can see those two perspectives just clashing.
And clash they did as Annaliese's symptoms, got worse and worse.
Yeah.
And the conventional treatments didn't seem to be working.
Yeah.
Her family and Anneliese herself started to believe that something more sinister was at play.
Right.
They started to see her suffering as not just a medical issue, but as a spiritual battle.
And this is where the sources get really intense.
Yeah.
They describe Anneliese exhibiting these really extreme behaviors like self-harm and aversion to religious objects,
Right.
and even claims of hearing demonic voices and seeing these disturbing visions.
And those claims really took root and spread, fueled by her religious upbringing and those prevailing beliefs of her community.
Right.
The family was desperate for a solution.
Yeah.
So they turned to the Catholic Church for help.
Yeah, and this wasn't, just a casual request for guidance or something. This was after years of what they perceived as failed medical interventions. Annaliese's family formally requested an exorcism.
Wow.
They were convinced that she was possessed by demonic forces.
It's such a pivotal moment in the story, and I think what's so fascinating and perhaps disturbing is that the church, after a really lengthy evaluation process, they actually authorized 2 priests to perform those exorcism rites on Anneliese.
So we're not talking about a family's private beliefs anymore.
No.
This was officially sanctioned by the church.
Right.
What do you think that says about the cultural context at the time?
Well, I think it highlights just how deeply intertwined religious beliefs and, these interpretations of illness were even in a supposedly modernizing society.
Right.
It just shows the power of those beliefs, to shape perceptions and influence decisions, even life-altering ones.
And this is really where things take a dark turn.
Yeah.
The sources describe these exorcism sessions in just chilling detail.
Yeah.
It's like they're painting this picture of these intense rituals that were held in secret at her family home.
Wow.
Hours of prayers, the use of holy water and religious objects. And Annaliese's behavior during these rites just became increasingly erratic and disturbing.
It's important to remember, though, that we're looking back on this with a modern lens, right?
Right.
At the time, for the people involved, these rituals represented hope.
Yeah.
They truly believed they were fighting a real spiritual battle for Annaliese's soul.
It's almost impossible to grasp, what was going through her mind during these sessions.
I know.
The sources mention that she even named the demons that she claimed were possessing her. Lucifer Cain, Judas Iscariot. Some accounts even include Hitler.
Wow.
It's like something out of a nightmare.
It's heavy stuff, but, those claims, no matter how disturbing they seem, now they were taken very seriously by everyone involved.
Right.
They reinforced that belief that this was genuine demonic possession.
Yeah.
And it required this drastic spiritual intervention.
And all of this is happening while Anneliese's physical health is just deteriorating.
Right.
It's just a tragic juxtaposition. This young woman battling what we now understand may have been a very severe mental illness. She's being subjected to these intense religious rituals that ultimately, failed to provide any relief.
Yeah, it's a really tough part of the story.
Yeah, and that really leads us to the next chapter in this complex and heartbreaking story.
Absolutely.
So we left off with Anneliese right in the middle of those intense exorcism rituals, her physical and mental health declining, and everyone around her like more and more convinced that it's demonic possession.
Right.
But that's not where her story ends.
No.
It actually takes an even darker turn.
It does. You see the exorcisms? Well, despite how intense they were and the really deeply held beliefs behind them, they failed to alleviate Anneliese's suffering.
Right.
Her condition continued to get worse and worse.
Yeah.
And in 1976, at just 23 years old, she died.
Yeah. It's hard to fathom, isn't it? A young woman struggling with what we understand now were likely some very serious mental health issues, dying in such a way.
Absolutely.
And the cause of death.
Malnutrition and dehydration.
Dehydration.
Yeah, the official autopsy report that confirmed those as the primary causes.
Right.
And, knowing what we've talked about with the exorcisms and her refusal of food and water, it raises some really serious questions.
Absolutely. It's impossible to ignore the context, right? This wasn't just a case of somebody, inexplicably refusing to eat.
Right.
It was so deeply intertwined with her spiritual battle and the belief that fasting was like a form of atonement for her sins.
Right, and that's where the legal system steps in.
Yeah.
Anneliese's death, well, it sparked a huge public outcry.
Of course.
Which led to a very publicized trial in 1978.
Wow.
Her parents and the two priests that had conducted the exorcisms, they were charged with negligent homicide.
That's a huge legal challenge, right? You have these religious beliefs and practices clashing head-on with secular law and our medical understanding.
Absolutely.
So how did the prosecution approach this case?
Well, their argument was really centered on the idea that Anneliese was a vulnerable young woman who was in desperate need of medical care.
Right.
And that her death was a direct result of those prioritizing this religious ritual over her well-being.
Right.
They essentially argued that the defendants had a duty of care towards Anneliese and that they just completely failed to uphold that.
Yeah, I imagine the defense presented a very different perspective.
Oh, they did. Their argument really hinged on the sincerity of their beliefs and actions.
Yeah.
They truly believed that Anneliese was possessed and that the exorcisms were her only hope.
Right.
And they also emphasized that Anneliese herself willingly participated in the rites and even refused medical treatment, which complicated the question of who was ultimately responsible for her choices.
It's such a classic example of that tension that exists between religious freedom and legal responsibility.
Yeah.
Right? Even when actions are driven by sincere belief.
For sure.
So what was the court's verdict?
The court in a decision that I think really reflects just how complex this case was.
Yeah.
They found all 4 defendants guilty of negligent homicide.
Wow.
They acknowledged the sincerity of the defendants' religious beliefs.
Right.
But ultimately held them accountable for their inaction that contributed to Anneliese's death.
So they were found guilty, but what was the actual punishment?
Well, this is where the verdict gets even more nuanced.
Okay.
They were each given a 6-month suspended prison sentence.
Wow.
And 3 years of probation.
That seems surprisingly lenient given the gravity of the outcome.
Yeah. I mean, it essentially is a slap on the wrist.
Did the court provide any reasoning for that seemingly light sentence?
Well, while the court records don't explicitly detail their rationale, it's likely they took in consideration the defendant's genuine belief in their actions.
Yeah.
The unprecedented nature of the case.
Yeah.
And just the immense public pressure surrounding it.
Of course.
The verdict, in a way, it kind of mirrored the ambiguity and moral dilemmas at the heart of this whole story.
It's almost as the legal system itself was struggling to grapple with the complexities of faith, mental illness, and personal responsibility.
For sure.
Right. The verdict didn't provide any easy answers.
No.
It just kind of added another layer to this already multifaceted case.
Exactly. And the impact of this case extended far beyond the courtroom.
Right.
The Catholic Church, facing this intense scrutiny and criticism,
Yeah.
they were forced to reevaluate their guidelines on exorcisms.
Of course.
They started to emphasize the importance of medical evaluation and consultation before even considering such drastic measures.
It's a significant shift, right? Recognizing the need for a more balanced approach.
Yeah.
Acknowledging the potential dangers of just solely relying on spiritual interpretations of what could be medical or psychological conditions.
Right. It was a turning point in how the church at least officially approached these types of cases.
Yeah.
But the case also kind of sparked a broader societal debate.
Right.
About this intersection of faith medicine and personal responsibility. It forced people to confront these uncomfortable questions about the limits of religious freedom, the ethical considerations of these spiritual interventions, and the importance of protecting vulnerable individuals.
And that debate, as you know, continues to this day.
It does.
Anneliese's story resonates with people decades later.
I agree.
Because it taps into these fundamental anxieties about the unknown, the power of belief, and the limits of our understanding.
Absolutely.
We're still grappling with the questions it raised. And perhaps we always will.
Right.
It's like this case ripped open this Pandora's box of questions about individual autonomy, the role of faith in healing, and the responsibilities we have towards those who are suffering.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
And as we delve into the final part of this deep dive, we're going to explore those questions even further.
Yeah.
We'll examine the psychological aspects of Anneliese's case.
Right.
And we'll try to make sense of what might have been going on in her mind during those really tumultuous years.
I'm ready.
Okay, so we've explored like the cultural context, you know, the clashing perspectives on her illness, the just harrowing details of the exorcisms, and then the legal fallout after her tragic death.
Yeah, it's been a lot.
But as we get into this final part of our deep dive, I think it's important for us to kind of shift our focus inward a little bit, you know, and try to understand what could have been happening in Anneliese's mind during those years of just intense suffering.
It's such a critical piece of the puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've talked about, you know, all the religious interpretations, the legal arguments.
Right.
But what about Anneliese's own experience?
Exactly.
What can we learn from her perspective?
Especially considering, you know, now we have such a deeper understanding of mental health than we did back in the 1970s.
Oh, absolutely.
When we look back at her symptoms through a modern lens, it's hard not to consider the possibility that she was dealing with, like, a very severe mental illness.
It's a really valid point.
Yeah.
We know she was diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy.
Right.
Which, as we've talked about, can cause those hallucinations and those altered states of consciousness. But the sources also suggest that she might have been experiencing symptoms that were really consistent with depression and even psychosis.
Can you explain a bit more about psychosis, you know, for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term?
Sure. Psychosis is kind of a broad term that covers a whole range of mental health conditions where a person's thoughts and perceptions become distorted.
Okay.
So, you know, they might experience hallucinations, things like hearing voices or seeing things that aren't there.
Right.
They might also have delusions, which are these firmly held beliefs that just aren't based in reality.
So how might these conditions have manifested in Anneliese's case specifically?
Well, imagine you're experiencing these really vivid auditory hallucinations, right?
Yeah.
You're hearing voices that sound totally real, and they're accusatory.
Wow.
They're telling you you're evil or possessed.
Right.
And combine that with delusions like maybe you start believing that you're being controlled by some outside force or that you have to do certain things to atone for your sins.
It paints such a different picture than just the demonic possession narrative, doesn't it?
It really does.
It's like instead of these malevolent spirits, you have this young woman who's battling this like chaotic and terrifying internal landscape, just struggling to make sense of her own thoughts and perceptions.
Exactly. And remember, this was a time when mental illness was so poorly understood.
Right.
And often stigmatized.
Of course.
It's not hard to see how in Anneliese's deeply religious environment, those symptoms could have been misinterpreted as something supernatural.
And that misinterpretation, as we've discussed, had these really devastating consequences. Instead of getting, you know, that specialized psychiatric care that she probably needed, she was subjected to these, you know, intense and ultimately harmful exorcism rituals.
It's a tragic example of how that lack of understanding and appropriate treatment for mental illness can have these really profound and even fatal consequences.
It really makes you think about Anneliese's own agency in all of this.
It does.
Was she really making informed decisions about her own treatment?
Right.
Or was she, in a sense, kind of a victim of those prevailing beliefs and anxieties of her time?
Those are such tough questions. And unfortunately, we just can't know for sure what was going through her mind.
Yeah.
But I think what we can do is learn from her story.
Absolutely.
And really strive to create a world where mental health is understood and addressed with compassion.
Yes.
And, never again mistaken for something that it's not.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, listener, we're left with this really complex and often unsettling case. It challenges us to really think critically about how faith medicine and personal responsibility kind of all interplay.
For sure.
It reminds us that sometimes the most challenging questions just don't have easy answers.
Absolutely. And maybe that's the most important takeaway.
Yeah.
Anneliese Michel's story, it's not just some historical curiosity. It's a call to action, urging us to continue the conversation about mental health.
Yes.
To advocate for those who are struggling and to ensure that tragedies like hers are never repeated.
Well said. Well, this has been quite the deep dive.
It has.
Thank you so much for your insights on this really tough case.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And listener, we'll see you on the next deep dive.